afternoon, everybody. This week I'm recording a little bit differently. Jim Morgan is not here with me, and I'm recording from a secret remote location, otherwise known as a secluded room in my house, with neither the crying baby or my other daughter. But I did want to make sure that we provided you with some scripture, some insights to consider, to encourage you, and to challenge you for you during the rest of this week. We did actually conclude our Bible study on Habakkuk last week, as we told you, and we will be starting a new study from the New Testament on 1 John, hopefully next week. But this week, since we needed to do a kind of an exception class, I wanted to challenge you with some additional thoughts from the book of Habakkuk. And as we went through Habakkuk, we shared with you several insights, not only to its immediate context and to its historical context, but to the nation of Israel at large. And then we did try to draw your attention to some additional applications of the teachings in this text to the New Testament times and even to our times today. And what I wanted to do is just take a second look at several different verses from the book of Habakkuk and look at the way that they inform us and educate us concerning the work of Christ that he did, and concerning our perception and our task that we have in living out our faith in the midst of the day and time that we live. So we're going to look at Habakkuk, we're going to look at these verses, and we'll first apply them to how do they help us to understand the work that Christ did, that Christ has done, and the work that Christ is doing. And then secondarily to that, we will look at the way that hopefully it informs and helps us in living out our Christian faith in our context today. Because we do know from the writings of Paul from Scripture that all of the Old Testament was not only written for its immediate context and for those people who lived through some of the events that we read about, but all of the Old Testament was written for our benefit and our instruction. And when he writes those words, he intends it to mean the church, those who live post-resurrection, those who know who Christ is and who have been saved by Jesus Christ. So we do want to make sure anytime that we study the Old Testament, even if it's a minor prophet or a major prophet, we might even be studying the book of Leviticus with all of its holiness code, or we might be studying the book of Lamentations with all of the laments and challenges that Jeremiah shares. But in every single Old Testament book, and I do believe this to be true, there is benefit, there are insights to gain into who Christ is, what Christ did, and who we should be. And I don't think it's a misapplication of Scripture. I think it's very much the way that the apostles wrote and understood the Old Testament, and Jesus himself in the Gospels, to be informing the work of God. So just to kind of recap the theme of Habakkuk, we have this discussion between a man of God, a prophet, someone who is in good standing with God, a righteous, holy man, a believer, and his discussion with a holy and righteous God, with our God. And that discussion comes from a place of seeing the evils not only in the world at large, but even some of the evils and some of the sinfulness among God's own people. And as a righteous man, as a prophet, as one who has a good relationship with God, it's very frustrating for Habakkuk to be exposed to be able to see and be living through. And so it frustrates him. And I think in that respect, we can relate in the world that we live. But first, let me make the application, as I mentioned, to Christ and the time in which he lived. We know that when Jesus is born, when he begins his ministry, when he experiences the religious world and his day and time, Jesus is very frustrated. But Jesus isn't frustrated by the sinfulness, the wickedness that he sees in Rome, or the sinfulness and the wickedness that he sees in the world at large. I think I would say that Jesus feels compassion towards those people, but Jesus' frustration, the anger that Jesus has, primarily, if you've read the New Testament, you understand that it's towards the religious people of his day. He had high expectations for them as those who had committed their lives to the studying of his word, to the understanding of the law, and to the application of the law. And he knew that the Pharisees, the Sadducees, the lawyers, the scribes, all of them were looked up to by the people of God. And so when Jesus sees a kind of rampant sinfulness among those leaders, when he sees the fact that they are indoctrinating the people of God into this false kind of righteousness and having people to believe that that's what God is seeking after, that really angers and upsets Jesus. And if we had any qualms about understanding that, or if we thought maybe that wasn't the case, all we need to do is read interactions between Jesus and the Pharisees, where he calls them a brood of vipers, and all the woes he puts upon them in the book of Matthew, and contrast that to places like John chapter 8 and the interaction that Jesus has with the woman who's caught in adultery, or John chapter 4 and the interaction that Jesus has with the woman at the well who's had so many marriages. And we can easily see not an acceptance of sin in either case, because Jesus in both cases addresses the concept of no longer sinning, but we can certainly see a difference in attitude, in the attitude of Jesus towards those who were the religious leaders and should have known better and claimed to know better and claimed to be representatives of God, versus those that Jesus knew were suffering under the bondage of sinfulness. So in that sense, when we consider Habakkuk's attitude and the complaints that he brings before God, it helps us, it informs us, it prepares us to understand Christ's frustration when he comes, and his frustration with the Pharisees and the Sadducees. And Habakkuk has that same frustration in his day. It's not just that sinfulness exists in the world, but it's kind of extra frustrating to Habakkuk to see this kind of rampant sinfulness among God's people. And when we look at God's response to Habakkuk, we hear God echo Habakkuk's frustration. God is also very frustrated with the sinfulness of his people, hence the severe judgment that he's going to carry out on them. And the same is true. We see that same attitude of God through Jesus, which we would expect to see towards the religious leaders in his day. We see the anger and the severe judgment that Jesus speaks with towards them, and this, like I said, this false kind of righteousness and relationship that they're purporting to have with God. So if we see it with Habakkuk and we see it with Jesus, then how does that theme, how does this principle that we see exemplified by them, how does it affect us as Christians today? And I think it's important for us to understand that when we look into the world, when we see sinfulness, brokenness, when we see people in bondage and just suffering under sin because they don't have the hope of Jesus Christ, because they don't have the relationship with God, or maybe they have a relationship with God, or maybe they have a understanding of God, but it's a misinformed understanding of that relationship, or it's based on a false premise of their own righteousness or their own good works or things like that. We need to have the same attitude that Jesus has of compassion towards those people. We long and we desire to help them get out of that bondage of sin through the grace of Christ, through the gospel of Jesus Christ. But we have an attitude of compassion. But when we see that kind of sinfulness among ourselves, the Bible tells us that we're to go to one another. In Matthew, it talks about the idea of leaving your offering and going and handling sin that exists between you and a brother. It talks about things like disfellowshipping. It talks about things like withdrawing ourselves from those who claim to be of God and yet choose to live a life of sinfulness. And more so than dealing with anybody else and their example that they are giving to the world and the way that they live out their relationship with God, first and foremost, we need to start, I think, with ourselves and being honest and genuine with ourselves and our relationship with God and what that looks like, and beginning there. So again, I think this is important. It's a theme that's introduced in Habakkuk, and really it starts even before that. And there are many places in the scriptures where the righteous are frustrated at the sinfulness that they see among the people of God. And so again, we see it with a minor prophet in the Old Testament, with Christ and what he deals with in his ministry, and there's a good application for us today in how we interact with those around us. So let's start looking at some of the specific verses I wanted to draw out. And they are several that we highlighted very heavily in our study. And so we're just going to kind of go back and look at those again. In Habakkuk chapter 1 and verse 5 is definitely one of the big thematic verses for me as I was going through and studying. And it's one I won't soon forget, especially because of the day and time that we live in. And what it says is, "Look among the nations and see and wonder and be astounded, for I am doing a work in your days that you would not believe if told." And this really resonates with me because certainly as a Christian, as a believer today, when I look around in the world, when I see all the things that are going on, maybe in our country specifically, but certainly the world and its turmoil and the struggles that are going on are not limited to our nation, but we see the persecution, this heavy persecution of the church in countries like China and the Sudan and various other places. And we recognize that there are some things that really kind of startle us and astound us. And we wonder sometimes, with these struggles going on in the world, how is God going to work through those things? And when God makes a specific statement that he's doing a work in your days that you would not believe if told, I certainly take that to heart, because I often ponder and wonder to myself, what is God going to do with everything as it sits today? What is God going to do with our situation in the United States? What is God going to do with the situation in Darfur, and the situation in China, and the situation in all these different parts of the world that have unique struggles and challenges to their nations, to their leaders, and to the church, to Christians who are trying to share the light there? And so I wonder what God is doing, and probably if God came to me today and said, "Look, Aaron, here's what I'm going to do, here's what I'm carrying out," it would be hard for me to grasp or understand or wrap my mind around what it is that God's doing. So this first thing from Habakkuk chapter 1 and verse 5, the thing I want to call it is wonder. It's important to understand the wonder of God. And I don't mean that to say strictly kind of the concept of the definition of wonder, meaning to ponder something. But I mean, when I say wonder, I mean like the awe of God. It's hard for us to just understand how vast eternity is. It's hard for us to understand what being truly omnipotent and omniscient and those kind of things mean, to be outside of time. But God truly is. And God, in the same way that he was working, and he's telling Habakkuk, in your days, I'm going to be working in those days. And if I told you, you wouldn't believe. I believe that's still true today. I believe that God is working. And so this first principle of wonder is important for us to understand. Now we take it from Habakkuk and we go again to Christ, and we look at Jesus when he comes into the world. And I think this same truth would be found there, this idea of wonder. When God comes to Joseph and Mary and tells them what's going to happen, there's a hesitancy there. As Jesus moves through his ministry, and we see him after years of raising the dead and healing the sick and performing miracles, I guess as he's coming to the close of his ministry, in places like the book of John, when he's going to wash the disciples' feet and he's revealing these things that are going to happen to them, the disciples resist what Jesus is saying. Jesus tells them specifically that I'm going to die, I'm going to be taken away, I'm going to suffer, these things are going to happen. And we don't see that even after all the miracles Jesus performed and the years of relationship he's built with them, we don't see a blind acceptance of those facts. They don't say, well, after all the authority we've seen that you have, and the revelation of the fact that you truly are the Son of God, we believe everything you're telling us. They don't just accept what Jesus is telling them. This idea of wonder, this same Habakkuk chapter 1 and verse 5 could have been easily quoted to them right before Jesus tells them what's going to happen, that look among the nations and see and wonder and be astounded. Well, the world was a hard place too during the time that Jesus lived. And the religious world among God's people is very corrupt. And the religious world was very polluted in Jesus' day, as was the Roman Empire and its relationship to the nation of Israel. Really its relationship to a lot of different peoples. There was a lot of corruption in the political systems of Rome at this time, and we see both of those things in the fact that an innocent man is crucified. Man, that the political leader said, I specifically know that you are innocent, but because of this mob, I'm going to give them what they want. That is definitely a corrupt system of justice. And for the religious leaders to acknowledge in places like John chapter 11, after Jesus raises Lazarus from the dead, they acknowledge that Jesus is capable of those things. They acknowledge that he has this power that must be from God, but they say it could cost us our position in society, and so we need to kill him and kill Lazarus. We need to get rid of all the evidence if we can. So we see again that corruption there. So that first part of 5, look among the nations, see and wonder and be astounded. It's like, wow, man, I mean, there's just so much going on in the world at this time, and yet God says, for I'm doing a work in your days that you would not believe if I told you. And certainly Jesus exemplifies that when he says, okay guys, here's exactly what's going to happen. And they say, oh no, Jesus, that would never happen. I'm not going to let that happen. Not on my watch will that happen. And so Peter says, not only would I go to prison with you or go to jail for you, but I would die for you. And after Peter makes that comment, all of the other apostles follow suit and kind of give Jesus that same sense. And so if that was possible to happen to the prophets, God specifically tells them what's going to happen, and they're like, oh, no way, that can't be what's going to happen. And if it could happen to the apostles who walked and talked with Jesus for years in his ministry, then I certainly believe that, at least for me, I'm no smarter or wiser. I have no more profound spiritual things in my life than they did. And so if it's possible for it to happen to them, then it's very likely it's the same with me. And so what does that really mean for us, this idea of wonder and this principle from Habakkuk chapter 1 and verse 5, practically speaking in our faith today? And I think the application is this. I think it's important for our foundation and our relationship with God and our expectations from God to be faith and trust. Faith and trust. Not only do we believe in God, but we believe in what God is doing. And even if we don't understand why, and even if we don't understand exactly how everything's going to turn out, we trust him anyways. And so if God tells us, that he's going to work through nations, we looked in our in-person Bible class a few weeks ago at Necho, the leader of Egypt, as he comes up and Josiah rejects the fact that God could be using him and intervenes, and very possible, it definitely cost Josiah his life, very possible it cost Necho the battle, which enabled Babylon to become the power it was, and ultimately is why they're able to be used by God. But Josiah couldn't believe it, and so he exercises his faith counter to what it is that God's trying to do. And so that's why it's so important for us. If God says that he can work through Egypt, he can work through Babylon, he can work through the United States, he can work through Democrats, Republicans, he can work through Canada, he can work through China, he can work through any person, nation that he wants to in this world to bring about his will. If God sees fit to put us through times of persecution, if God sees fit to put us through times of blessing, whatever it is that is the will of God, then we not only have faith in God, but we trust in God. And even sometimes if we don't necessarily understand that plan or believe that God could do those things, we trust in it anyways. And that's where Habakkuk had to come to. That's where the apostles had to come to. And it's where we need to come to today. And maybe the biggest thing that we need to never lose sight of, but on some days it's hard to believe, is the fact that Jesus is coming back. And no matter what happens in this world, it's never going to alter or change that fact in any way, shape, or form. And so the fact that Jesus Christ is coming back, there's people in the New Testament, the apostles write about the fact that there are those who say, hey, look, today's just like every other day. Look what's going on in the world. The sun's still shining. We're still doing our grocery shopping. We're still, nothing's really changed. So, Jesus isn't coming back. It's never going to happen. But we can never allow ourselves to lose our faith and trust in God. We have to continue to believe in what Jesus promised and that he's coming back. So maybe more so than any other application we could make with this concept of wonder from Habakkuk 1:5. That's one that we need to keep in mind. If you're with me in Habakkuk, let's kind of move to the next verse. that I want to highlight, and that's in chapter 2. And in chapter 2 and verse 1, it says, I will take my stand at my watchpost, and I will station myself on the tower, and look out to see what he will say to me, and what I will answer concerning my complaint. So this second principle I want to talk about from Habakkuk and make application of is the idea of watching. And I don't mean by watching simply, let me get in my lazy boy recliner, let me put my feet up, let me just sit back and wait and see what God's going to do and live my life and my faith out passively. But rather, if you really look at what it is that Habakkuk is saying, he says, I'll take my stand at my watchpost. He's saying this is an active, engaging in looking to see the answer from God and searching out and being wide-eyed and scanning back and forth, putting himself in a position where it's easy for him to observe what it is that God is doing. He says, I station myself there. I'm committed to this purpose. And I look out to see what God's response will be and how I will answer my complaint. So Habakkuk knows the only way to really answer his question, to answer his complaint with God, he can't really go and say, well, I'm going to go search out the high priest and see what he says. We know from Habakkuk, we know from Jeremiah, we know from just reading the history, places like 2 Kings, that not only were the people corrupt, but it specifically says that the priesthood had become corrupt. Habakkuk knows he can't rely on another man to give him an answer. He knows he can't rely on a king. Even King Josiah, as good as he was, ultimately loses his life fighting against what God is trying to do through Necho. And so, he can't rely on the political leaders. He can't rely on the religious leaders. He can't really even rely on himself to answer the complaint. But he knows if he looks actively, if he engages himself, positions himself to see what it is that God's doing, he can find an answer to his complaint from God. And so that idea of watching, I think, is really important. And again, to kind of follow what I wanted our process to be today, we make application first with Christ in his day and time. When we get into the New Testament and we look at what Jesus does in the Gospels to connect himself, to immerse himself in God's will throughout his life, he continually does several things that I think helps Jesus gain or regain perspective on God's will and on what the implications of that will is for Jesus. What God's answer is sometimes when I think that, quite frankly, Jesus has questions, maybe not in the same sense as we do, but certainly has questions. One of the things that Jesus does, and I think this is his way of going up to take a stand at the watchpost and stationing himself there till he receives an answer, is when Jesus is becoming overwhelmed by the mobs, when Jesus gets frustrated with his close friends and their lack of faith or their lack of support that they give to Jesus, he withdraws himself and he takes very specific time for himself with his relationship with God. And he does that through solitude, he does that through prayer, he does that through talking to God. And I think that's an important way as well to just go ahead and jump to the application to us. That's an important thing for us to do as well. It's so easy to become immersed in the discourse that goes on about politics and the discourse that goes on about the future of our country or the world or whatever the case may be, to be so immersed sometimes in the despair and the darkness that exists in the world that it begins to diminish our light as opposed to our light shining even more brightly in the midst of the darkness. And so it's important then for us to disengage, to step away, if you will, and to make sure that we're taking equal time at least to immerse ourselves in the Word of God and our relationship with God, to cause our light then to be strengthened and re-solidified so that we can go back into the darkness. And it's us having an influence on the darkness and not the darkness having an influence on us. So we see Jesus, that's a way that he takes a stand at the watchpost. He stations himself there to get a response from God. It's something that we can also do to do the same. Also, Habakkuk makes his complaint known to God. He tells God, look, God, here's a situation. I mean, I just don't think it's right or fair for you to use Babylon to punish your people. Look how much worse they are. Look how wicked they are. And to use, to make the application to Jesus to help us kind of make that bridge to the New Testament, we could kind of lay out Habakkuk's complaint in terms of, if there's any way to let this cup pass from me, let it pass. If there's any way to punish Israel, to get rid of the wickedness of the religious leaders without having to punish them with Babylon, let's do it that way. And then he sits back and waits for God's response. Well, obviously, Jesus does the same thing when we get to the Garden of Gethsemane. Jesus comes to God and he makes his complaint, if you will, his argument, his position clear to God. And he says, Lord, if there's any other way possible, Jesus understands the weight, the gravity of this judgment that's going to be carried out, the sin he's going to have to bear, the burden, or not burden, but the turmoil it's going to put his family into, his mother and his brothers. He understands the shame that he's going to bring on his family and upon himself and upon his followers. He understands all those things that are going to happen, that time of darkness that occurs after the crucifixion. I mean, he understands all of these things that are going to happen, and he says, Lord, if there's any other way, let's do this another way. But then he finishes with this all-important statement and says, not my will, but yours be done. It's very easy to see that concept of watching in that statement. Habakkuk says, Lord, here's where I'm at. I don't know about this letting Babylon punish your people thing, but I'm going to go. I'm making it clear to you. I don't understand it. I'm not sure if I'm even on board with it. I mean, this is so much to take in. But then he says, let me sit back and take my stand, station myself, and await your response. Jesus does the same thing and says, Lord, not my will, but yours be done. Here's my position. Here's how I perceive things. I'm wrestling. I'm grappling with the gravity of what's going to happen. But ultimately, my faith and my trust is in you. And whatever your answer is, even if it's the hard answer, I'm willing to follow your will. And I think that's important for us in terms of this concept of watching, because I don't know about you, but that would pretty much explain, that pretty much connects with, illustrates my prayer life of late, and really for quite some time. Lord, if it takes a reckoning, if it takes something catastrophic, if it takes something that to just bring the whole world, if need be, or just our country or the church or whatever the case is, I mean, if that's what it takes to bring about your will, to cause people to stop being so self-centered, to cause people to stop being so content with living lives of sin, or having lukewarm or having a lukewarm relationship with you, if that's what it takes for people to start taking you seriously and understand that we're not in control, that man doesn't have the answers to everything, I mean, Lord, I don't want to see that kind of judgment. I don't want to see a catastrophic thing. I don't want our nation to go through dark or difficult times. I don't want this world to go through that. I don't want my family to go through it. I don't want, Lord, I mean, it's a heavy thing to try and consider. But at the end of the day, as I pray those prayers, I station myself at my watch post and I await the answer from God. And in the words of Jesus, not my will, but yours be done. If it be that hard thing, if it needs to be that judgment, then Lord, I trust you, I accept it, and I will follow you through it, and I will be obedient to you no matter what. I accept your will. So that watching is so important for us to understand, as it was for Habakkuk, as it was for Jesus, so it is for us today. So we have the idea of wonder and the fact that God is capable of doing things and is doing things that even if he explained it to us, we wouldn't believe it. We wouldn't be able to fully understand it. Secondly, we need to be watching. We need to position ourselves, actively engage, place ourselves as far as our understanding where we can have that kind of dialogue with God in that relationship and look to him for the answer. Not to the world, not to the religious world, not to other people, but that we look to God. We look to the Word of God and we await his response, because it's the only answer that's really going to help our heart and our soul resolve those issues. The third thing comes from Habakkuk chapter 2 and verse 2 and 3. It says, write the vision, make it plain on tablets, so he may run who reads it. In other words, write the vision down, make it plain on tablets, make it something that's lasting and permanent. Don't just keep it in your mind, but etch it in stone. And when he talks about this idea of let the one run who reads it, in other words, you set it, the message in stone so that it can be preserved, and then you send people out with it, the runners, the messengers. You send them out to make everybody aware of what the message is. And in verse 3 it says, "For still the vision awaits its appointed time. It hastens to the end, and it will not lie. If it seems slow, wait for it. It will surely come, and it will not delay." So the third principle I want to look at for us, or highlight this afternoon, is waiting. Waiting. And waiting, you might think, well, waiting sounds an awful lot like watching. And maybe in some respects it is. But again, when I say waiting, I don't mean waiting in a passive sense where we're disengaged or we're just kind of complacent until something happens. But it's more a waiting that is pregnant with anticipation. I mean, just full, just waiting. It's just this anticipation where we're not anxious about it, but we're just ready for something to happen. And again, as we look at Jesus' ministry and we start there making application, what Jesus did first and foremost when he comes and he has this revelation, he has this gospel to share, he implants it, he delivers it out to anyone who's willing to hear. He delivers the gospel. He is a messenger of the gospel. But notice that one of the things that people are struggling to get on the same page with Jesus about is the when of all the things that he's talking about. Well, when is the kingdom going to come, right? When is this going to come to pass, the deliverance that you're supposed to bring as the Messiah? When are these things going to come to pass? And one of the things that comes up, and some of the Gospels more than others, is the concept of an appointed time, that these things at the right time, such and such happen. At the right time, such and such happen. There's an appointed time for things to occur, and that's important. And that's important in Habakkuk chapter 3. And Jesus was a master of understanding this due to the fact that he really understood God's plan. Galatians uses the term that in the fullness of time, God brings these things to pass. So that's important. But Jesus also understood the latter half of verse 3. The fact of the matter is there's an appointed time for things to happen. Okay? It will not lie. So if God has promised it, if God has set it in motion, if God has designated a time for it to happen, then it's not a question of if it will happen. It's simply a question of when it will happen. And if it seems slow, wait for it, because it will come without delay. It'll be here before you know it, is what Habakkuk is saying. Or rather what God's saying to Habakkuk. And Jesus understood that. Jesus was on the earth for 33 years, but I'd imagine those 33 years must have gone by probably just about as fast as my 35 years have gone by, if not more so. I don't know how many times I've heard somebody say, that's had children, it felt like, they were born and then all of a sudden they were married and had their own kids. I mean, it just seems like it went by that fast. Or people who have worked long careers with, the same company or in the same field, and they say, I felt like I just started and here I am finishing 40 years later. It just goes by, time goes by so fast. And there's so much truth to that. And yet when we're going through difficult times, time seems to kind of stretch a little bit, and it seems like even days can seem like an eternity. And also when we're really anticipating something coming, it can make time seem longer. And if you've forgotten, I know, for instance, when you were a child and your birthday was coming up, or Christmas was coming up, or these big events that we would anticipate and look forward to so much, it just made it seem like time stood still until those events came to pass. So there's so much truth in this. If it seems slow, wait for it. It will come. It will surely come without delay. Well, we say, man, Jesus said he's coming back soon, and it's been 2,000 years. I mean, that doesn't sound like soon to me. And yet we're Jesus and God's plan, the appointed time is not on our schedule, it's on God's schedule. And certainly to God, 2,000 years to a being who's been around for all of eternity is certainly a drop in the bucket. So for Jesus, he understood there's an appointed time. It wasn't going to lie. He knew what was going to come to pass. The apostles say, no, we can change that. We'll fight it. I'll pull my sword out. I'll hack people's ears off. I'll do whatever it takes. We're going to stop this from happening. And Jesus understood that, no, God has appointed a time for this, and it's going to come to pass. It will not lie. And so wait for it. And that wait for it, I think, making the application into us, man, that's the hard part. We talked about Sunday, Abraham. God promises to Abraham that he's going to have this son, and so many things happen between God promising that to Abraham and Abraham leaving Haran, and then Abraham actually having that son. And we sometimes look at the promises of Scripture and we're like, okay, God promised it, in chapter 12, and it comes true in chapter 19, and so, and I'm just throwing those out as for instances, but so it's only 4 chapters, or it's only 3 verses, and it comes to pass. But we have to be careful to remember, in cases like Abraham's, it's 25 years that pass. God makes the initial promise at 75 years old, and Abraham's 100 before Isaac is born. 25 years can be a long time, but God tells Abraham, there's an appointed time for you to have a son. And if God says there's an appointed time, then it's going to happen. He's not going to lie. And so, even if it seems slow, 25 years, wait for it. Don't go to Hagar and have Ishmael. That's not what God said. He told you you're going to have a son through Sarah, and you wait. And even if it seems slow, you wait. And so this is an important principle for us to understand, because God's told us, again, maybe first and foremost, above all the other promises and things that we anticipate and expect as Christians, is the second coming of Jesus Christ. The fact that he's going to come again to bring his own unto him. And so, God has set an appointed time for that. When is that time? We don't know. The Bible specifically tells us that nobody knows. But the fact is, there's an appointed time. How do we know? Because Jesus told us there's an appointed time. And the apostles furthermore tell us that there's an appointed time, that this is going to come to pass. So we know that for a fact. Now, if God set an appointed time for something to happen, then we know that it won't lie. We know that's not a matter of it, will it come true, but when will it come true? So then what does our task become as Christians? Well, it's back to that idea of faith and trust. If it seems slow, wait for it. And for all of us, for anyone who's participating in this class this afternoon, for me, 35, even just in my lifetime, the years, and just the years I've been a Christian, which is less than 35 years, it seems a little slow. And as things become more intense, and as we see the world drifting farther from God, our desire becomes deeper for it to happen sooner rather than later. But it's not my job to try and speed up God's timetable. It's not my job to try and figure out and put together algorithms of when Jesus is coming back. It's not the task that I've been given. It's not the task that Habakkuk was given. The task Habakkuk was given was write it down, tell everyone the message, and then trust that it's going to happen. Wait for it. And we have that same task as Jesus did, as the apostles did. Our job is to take the promises of God, is to take the revelation of God, to write it down. In our case, it's already been written in Scripture, but to write it on our hearts, and then to go out on our feet shod with the gospel of peace, right? And spread the gospel of Jesus Christ, to tell everyone that we can, and then to wait for his appearing. And again, not in a passive sense, not in a sit back and do nothing sense, but in a very eager sense of waiting and desiring to see him come again. Let's go a little bit further. I just have 2 more, I think, left that I want to go over. So we have the wonder of God, the fact that God is able to and is working out things that even if he told us we might not be able to comprehend or believe the way that he's going to bring about his will. 2, we have the watching that we need to be doing, positioning ourselves to see the will of God and communicating with God about our concerns and those kind of things, but always with a spirit of acceptance of God's response. Thirdly, the idea of waiting on God, being sure of the fact that what he has appointed will come to pass, but not simply sitting back, but engaging during our time of waiting. And then thirdly, I want to go to the end of chapter 2 and talk a little bit about worship. Now let's start in verse 18 of chapter 2. What profit is an idol when its maker has shaped it? A metal image, a teacher of lies. For its maker trusts in his own creation when he makes speechless idols. Woe to him who says to a wooden thing, awake, to a silent stone, arise. Can this teach? Behold, it's overlaid with gold and silver, and there is no breath at all in it. But the Lord is in his holy temple. Let all the earth keep silence before him. This fourth concept, this fourth theme or idea that comes out of the book of Habakkuk is on worship and who or what do we worship. And that's very important because not only our position in terms of where, to use kind of a biblical term or idea, concept, to where we set our face to worship is where our life is going to go. Try, setting your face to the left and then walking to the right. And wherever your head is set is the direction, your face is set is the direction you're going to head in. When it comes to worship, it's very important for us to have our face, to have our hearts and our minds set in the right direction. Places like Colossians would talk about set your mind on things above. Okay, Hebrews says fix your eyes on Jesus, the author and perfecter of our faith. So this is very important. What we worship, who we worship is very, very important for us to have an understanding of. And as much as we kind of can joke and laugh about places like Jeremiah where he deals with idols, Isaiah has a great section where he talks about worshiping one side of a log while the other side burns in the fire to make your bread. As much as we can humor ourselves over some of the places in Scripture where the preposterous nature of idolatry is addressed, it's important for us to recognize that idolatry, that the studying of or the worshiping of things and what's in the world and the worshiping of creation itself goes back to basically the beginning. And so that being the case, in places like Ecclesiastes, nothing new under the sun. I mean, people are still worshiping stuff and what's, and people are still worshiping things instead of worshiping a who, instead of worshiping God, instead of worshiping the one and only God, the creator instead of the creation. And Romans 1 really highlights that well, talking about those who chose, even though they knew God, they chose to worship the created things. So it's important for us to understand what worship is. In Habakkuk's day and time, people were choosing to worship metal images. In Jesus' time, people were still having struggles worshiping metal images. People were also, during various points throughout the New Testament church, worshiping images of people, like the emperor, and falling in line with their culture and their society of their day. People were worshiping themselves in their own self-righteousness. That's what they were putting their faith and trust in for their salvation into, not in God or even in the Old Testament law that God had given them before Christ, but they were putting their faith and their trust in their own additions to the law, their own ability to be righteous or better than other people. And so in that sense, they were worshiping themselves, relying on themselves to do what God had told them he would do and to do it their way instead of his way. And so in Jesus's day and time, that was a real struggle that people were having. They were worshiping. So a lot of the people were worshiping the religious leaders of the day. They just did what they told them to do and kind of blindly followed them. Jesus talks about that, the blind leading the blind. And so it was a problem in Jesus' day as well. And so we take the same principle that Habakkuk gives us about worship, and we look at what is laid out here. Basically, the argument that's being made is that people trust in what they're able to do themselves more than in God. And that's what it means when it says the maker trusts in his own creation. Okay? So we need to move away from worshiping what we're able to do ourselves. And also, one of the things that's emphasized in this section is that these things are built to be enticing, to be beautiful, to be precious in the sense of their monetary value, covered in gold and silver. And also there's silence. So those are basically the three elements: things we can do ourselves, things that are enticing, beautiful, valuable in a monetary sense, and then things that are silent. Those are the three characteristics or qualities that are highlighted in Habakkuk. And certainly we see Jesus engaging with people who were dealing with those same struggles. The religious leaders were trusting in what they could do for themselves. That's a problem. That's idolatry. That's setting your face and worshiping in the wrong direction. It's going to lead you to nowhere. We had people like the rich young ruler who was enticed and drawn into things that were beautiful and valuable in a monetary sense. His face was set on those things. He was worshiping those things. And so he's willing to walk away from the Son of God. And we certainly see those who are looking to the mute, so to speak, for answers to spiritual questions, and the ones they're looking to cannot provide them those spiritual answers. And so it might as well be a wooden statue on the mantle during Jesus's time. So Jesus responds to all of those things. He tries to help people understand that there's something more valuable, it should be more enticing for us than gold and silver. It's more precious than those things, because thieves can steal those things and moths and rust can destroy those things. But what Jesus has is more valuable than those things. And man can create a lot of things for himself. Man can do a lot of impressive things, but man is only capable of so much. And man, the one most important thing man is not capable of to do himself is to save himself. And so Jesus had to come and seek and save the lost. Jesus had to come because we as mankind were not capable of saving ourselves. And lastly, Jesus is the embodiment of the Word of God. He reveals the will and the Word of God to us, and therefore he becomes the voice where all of the other sources that people were searching out for spiritual truth were coming back void and empty. God says, my word will never return void and empty. So what does all that mean for us today then? What it means is when it comes to worshiping, we need to set our faces and fix our eyes on Jesus Christ. We need to be careful not to become focused or consumed by the creation itself, by the things that exist around us, even our own bodies, even our own health, even our own, the longevity of our own life. Yes, we want to have those things. We work towards having those things, but we don't live and die based on, or our faith, I should say, doesn't live and die based on our health, based on what's going on in the world, based on if there's tornadoes or hurricanes, based on whatever's happening with creation itself. Our faith does not live and die with those things. Our faith is in God, and our trust is in Jesus Christ. So the world may be sometimes consumed with those things, but our faith and trust needs to be bigger and stronger and on God, and not just created things. It needs to be on the Creator. And second to that, kind of the same principle goes to those things that are enticing and monetarily valuable. In our lifetime, we may be stripped of all those things. We may have to go from whatever luxuries we enjoy today to struggling to be able to put food on the table. That may be a reality for us, but we cannot allow that to then destroy our faith. Our faith needs to be greater, and our faith needs to be in God, and not those things that are enticing. We don't need to pursue more and more stuff, and we don't need to pursue wealth and competing with all of our neighbors and those kind of things to the detriment of our faith and to the detriment of our pursuit of our relationship with God. And lastly, we need to not pursue silent things. We don't need to look for answers to spiritual questions on social media. We don't need to Google it. We don't need to, seek it out from friends and neighbors per se. We need to search for answers to spiritual questions. We need to search for spiritual guidance. We need to set our worship on God and let Him be the one who fills our need for knowledge, who fills our need for joy, who fills our need for hope, who fills our need for all these things through His Word, because His voice is truly the only voice of truth, and not what essentially is a silent voice on spiritual issues, or a useless voice, maybe is a better way to say it. Lastly, in verse 20, this is important in Habakkuk and in Jesus and with us, to this idea of worship. The Lord is in His holy temple, let all the earth keep silent before Him. the fact of the matter is, all these other things are built and we place them, we put them on the pedestal. God's been on the pedestal all along. God is seated in his holy temple. God is in his rightful place. God is in the place of true worship. God is ready to receive worship. He's worthy of worship. And the fact that the whole earth is silent before him means we're speechless in the presence of God. The reverence, the awe of God. When Abraham's in the presence of God, it says he falls to his face. When Isaiah's in the presence of God, he's overcome by the sense of his own unworthiness because God's in his temple. We see that constantly associated with the presence of God, just this reverence and immediate awe and a sense of unworthiness. And so that's what the Bible is saying. It's contrasting God with all of those other things. In the other scenario, the idols are silent, but when it comes to God, the people are silent because of just how powerful, how awesome, and I mean that in the truest sense of the word, God is. So let's move on to the last one. I'm not even sure what the time is because I'm lacking my partner, Jim, today, and he's usually the one that keeps us on track as far as time. So if I'm going over, I apologize, but I guess you can always stop the video when you feel like you've had enough of my voice. But let me just finish up with the end of chapter 3 for our Bible study for our time together today. The last principle I want to talk to you about is the idea of will. And what I mean by will is our will, our fortitude, our determination when it comes to our relationship with God. And how far does that will, our will, go in terms of our relationship with God? Let's just kind of refresh ourselves, remember a little bit where we're at in Habakkuk. Habakkuk makes his complaints known to God, and God responds to those complaints. And this is the very end. This is Habakkuk's final words back to God after everything that's been said and considered. And I think this is just some of the most powerful verses that can be uttered by us or about us in terms of our relationship with God. Here's what it says. It says, though the fig tree should not blossom, nor fruit be on the vines, the produce of the olive fail, and the fields yield no food, and the flock be cut off from the fold, and there be no herd in the stalls. What Habakkuk is describing here is utter and complete devastation at every single level. We recognize, or we remember the story in the New Testament where Jesus goes by the fig tree that has no figs, and we see how Jesus deals with that fig tree and how upset it makes him. The false promise of that fig tree that should have had figs there, but does nobody any good because it doesn't bear fruit. There's no fruit on the vines, which affects what's available to drink, what's available to consume that way, to drink. The produce of the olive fail. Olives were used in a vast quantity of ways among the ancient Near Eastern peoples and were very valuable. So this is really a big hit to the pocketbook. I mean, a big time hit to the pocketbook. It affects, if you don't have any olives, it affects a lot of the cooking, preparation and things that they did. And like I said, it just was used in so many different various capacities that it would affect your life at every level if there were absolutely no olives in that day and time. The fields yield no food. So not only do you not have drink, you have no food. The flock be cut off from the fold. Again, think about prior to our time, the flocks were not only useful for consuming as food, but they were a valuable resource. They provided clothing and all kinds of things to the people. So again, not only the economic impact of that, but being, think of it in terms of the fig tree, maybe in terms of no sustenance, the fruit being nothing to drink, the olives being economic despair, the fields being hunger, the flocks being lack of provision, and then no herd in the stalls. It's just complete and utter devastation. Now we really gotta let that resonate with us a little bit. To be able to understand, to be able to apply it to Jesus, then to be able to make that application to us. We really need to resonate with the idea. We are talking about stripped completely of everything, okay? Think about Romans 8 level type stuff when it says, nothing will separate us from the love of God, not pestilence, not sword, not nakedness, not all these things that he lists off. That's all covered here. So complete and utter devastation, being stripped literally of every single thing that you have. Think Job. Okay, think Job in the first couple of chapters, stripped of literally every single thing that he had. Now, once we wrestle that out, once we let that resonate and we wrap our minds around that, being completely stripped of everything. I mean, you wake up tomorrow and literally the only stuff you have is your clothes on your back. Everyone and everything that you know other than that is completely gone and separated from you. That's what he's talking about in verse 17. Then in 18, following that up, he says, yet, even if all of that, yet, if I woke up that day and everything was gone, I will rejoice in the Lord, and I will take joy in the God of my salvation. Now this is heavy stuff. This is a serious testament to the faith that Habakkuk has through this process that he's gone through with God. Just try and picture in your mind, just think about some of the things that you love and cling to the most. And to start with physical things, because that's really most of what he lists out here. I mean, think about tomorrow, your house is gone. I mean, your house. However long you've lived in your house. I've only lived in my house now for probably 3-4 years. But it'd be hard to wake up tomorrow and not have my house. I mean, all the memories I have here with my family would all be gone. Not to mention the fact of the emotion of being homeless, of having no shelter, no roof over my head, no warm place to bring my family, to not have a house tomorrow. Imagine the car being gone. Not only is the house gone, but the car's gone. Now, how am I going to get my family where they need to go? How will I get to work? Never mind all that, but work's gone. The elders let me go. And I have no job, no way to provide for my family. Imagine waking up tomorrow and that being the case. And furthermore, from there, even like Job, our family, waking up tomorrow, I had no family. And you really start to think about those things, and you hopefully feel some of that devastation that would bring into your life. And Habakkuk says, all of that happening, and yet I will rejoice in the Lord, and I will take joy in the God of my salvation. Now you start to think about that, just all those personal things, and we'd have to say, well, even if there's COVID, even if I'm put in quarantine, even if there's a storming of the Capitol, even if there's riots from the discord and the division that exists in the country along racial and ethnic lines, even if there's toilet paper shortages, even if there's anger in the streets, even if there's high taxes, even if there's a health crisis in the world, even if there's this, that, and whatever you want to list off, you have to follow 17 with 18 as where Habakkuk gets to. Yet, even with all that, I will rejoice in the Lord, and I will take joy from the God of my salvation. Once you begin to let that kind of set with yourself, then we can move easily to Jesus. And we can see Jesus in the New Testament. Jesus is stripped of everything that he loved in his life. He's torn away from his mother. Death tears him away from his mother, from his brothers. The cross, even just the being his arrest and his being put in front of the crowds, he's looking into the eyes of his own people, and not just Israel, but even looking into the eyes of the Roman soldiers and knowing that these are the people I'm dying for, and yet they hate me, and yet they're spitting on me and flogging me, and yet they've nailed me to this piece of wood. And he looks out and he sees John and his mother, but he knows that the other ones whom he loves so much are not even present with him during this last time. He's stripped of any sense of wealth. He's stripped of any honor. He's stripped of any reverence anyone had for him as a rabbi or a teacher. He's completely left with nothing but shame and nakedness, essentially on the cross. It's all gone. And then ultimately he goes into the tomb, he dies. And at that point, literally everything that Christ had has been stripped from him. And yet he rejoices in the Lord, and he takes joy in the God of his salvation. We know that from the book of Hebrews, where it says, for the joy set before him. We know it because Jesus is willing to go to the cross. We know it because Jesus understood the weight of what it was that God was calling him to do. And so we see all of that through Jesus. We see the fact that it doesn't deter Jesus' relationship with God. And the question we have to ask ourselves is, when it comes to my will, when it comes to my determination, what are the limitations of my love for God? What are the limitations of my relationship with God? What are the things in this life, if I didn't have them anymore, I would walk away from God? I don't love God enough to go on in relationship with him without those things. And that's a hard question to be really honest about. But it's one that Paul says he had to wrestle with in Philippians. He said, man, I learned the secret of what it is to be content. I can do all things through Christ who strengthens me. I can go without, or I can have. I can be hungry, or I can be full. I can be naked, or I can be clothed. I can be in prison, or I can be free. It doesn't matter the circumstance I find myself in. I will find my contentment in Christ. Romans chapter 8, again, it talks about all these things in and of themselves can't separate us from Christ. But if we decide that, having a full stomach is more important than our relationship with God, then that can become a problem. And time again, the New Testament talks about rejoicing in the Lord. Rejoice, and again I say rejoice. We consider it all joy, brothers and sisters, when you go through all kinds of trials and tribulations, James says in James chapter 1. So what is our will, our determination when it comes to our relationship with God? Could we say what Habakkuk says in 17 and 18? Let's just finish with 19. He just says, God, the Lord is my strength. He makes my feet like the deer's and causes me to tread on high places. I hope looking at these things this afternoon has been helpful to you. We talked about wonder. We talked about watching. We talked about waiting. We talked about worship. And we talked about will. And looking at all those things through the eyes of an Old Testament prophet that lived almost maybe 3,000 years ago, or he was alive 3,000 years ago, but was writing these things about that long ago. We see how valid it was for him in his historical context. But we also see the way that if someone had read Habakkuk, it would have prepared them to further understand, to more deeply understand Jesus's life and his ministry, and also how it informs and helps us in our walk with God today. So I hope that's been helpful to you. Look forward to getting into 1 John and the introduction next week with Jim. Pray that this is a blessing to you. I pray that you have a good week, and that God continues to watch over and bless you in your relationship with him. Take care.